The Nissan 370Z Nismo. This car has been around for 11 years at this point. And with the 400Z well on its way, we thought it was a good time to put this car out to pasture, celebrate its 11 years of existence, walk you through what it's like to drive today, some of the engineering that went into it, and talk about some of its deficiencies. So with that, enjoy the video. Inside the 370Z Nismo. Now let's talk about what makes this different from a lesser Z car on the inside. The first thing to bring up are these Recaro seats. They look great, they're a mix of leather and Alcantara, and when compared to the base Z seats, they are far more comfortable and far more supportive as well. They are only manually adjustable, they do not raise or lower, however, the seat bottoms do tilt and the seat back tilts as well. The manual track gives you enough legroom for taller drivers, and this cabin, like in the regular Z, still has a reasonable amount of headroom. You should be able to fit if you're below, say, 6'2". The rest of this cabin is also changed a little bit. You have Alcantara door cards with red contrast stitching, and the steering wheel is now a mix of leather and Alcantara with a leather red centering stripe. And just like in most cars, if you use this every single day, Alcantara does not wear well. After about 20 or 30,000 miles, it will feel like you're crushing Oreos into someone's hairy back. They are horrible in that regards. The rest of this cabin is one of the more upscale Z offerings, which means you have navigation, a backup camera, and the Bose audio system is standard. The last two things I want to talk about before we head to the shop are some of the interior design quality issues and the infotainment system. First, the infotainment system. All your controls are physical, which is normally a good thing. However, the head unit is very cumbersome to use. However, your HVAC controls are thankfully still physical. The audio system in this car is average. It's a Bose system. It really does sound old. There's a bit of distortion, and because the noise floor is high, when you're at highway speeds, it's not the best thing in the world. However, no one is buying a Z for the audio system, and I acknowledge that. So with that, let's head to the shop.
Underneath the 2020 370 Nismo, this is the going away party, Jack.
Yeah. Thankfully, Nissan is finally refreshing this car after nearly 11 years.
Maybe refreshing it. It's a prototype.
Yeah, true. And with Nissan's recent financial troubles, it may never actually exist. But what we have here is an old car with some old car charm.
So this is the most hardcore 370Z in the existence.
Yes, but saying this is a track car and trying to turn it into a track car is a fool's errand, as I'm about to bring up in the drive segment and a little bit during our shop segment. So let's talk about what we have here in the front, Mark.
Yeah, it looks like you got something that Nissan has typically done on a lot of their cars. You have a lot of aluminum, but this is extremely rare for cars of this vintage or age. Aluminum subframe carrier, double wishbone, as you mentioned, and you have big brakes, you have Akibonos, I'm sorry, and you also have Nismo pads or higher friction pads. You have an increased roll stiffness. The dampers and spring rates are 40% stiffer in the front and over 140% stiffer in the back. So when you put all that together and then you put on these snow tires, you get the ultimate in lateral grip. But when you're on the real tires, this thing has a ton of grip. It is completely competent if you drive within its limits.
And you have a old school, at least old school for modern day, steering rack in the front. It's hydraulic.
Yes, which you can see the hydraulic lines running through. In fact, you can see most of the whole underbody because this predates any underbody coverings and all the things that they're doing in modern cars.
Yep. So let's head to the rear, Mark.
Sounds good. We've migrated our way to the rear half of the 370 Nismo, Jack. What do we have?
Oh boy, we have an HKS exhaust. If you wanted to win, this is what lets you win. It gives you a horsepower advantage along with the unique engine tuning over the regular 370Z. This makes 350 horsepower. And it sounds like the world's worst vacuum cleaner.
I don't agree with you at all, but I mean...
It sounds like a Japanese tractor. It is not a sweet tonal, quality.
I will admit that Nissan has a unique tone. It doesn't bother me. I'd rather have this than some piece of shit four-cylinder pile that just sounds like you're blowing your mouth through a fucking straw.
I don't disagree with you, but you compare this to the V8 offerings from the American competition, you got a big problem.
Nobody is buying V8s anymore, Jack. That shit is irrelevant.
Is it because of our Lord and Savior Elon Musk?
Yes, he's going to make all of this irrelevant. We're not even going to be talking about exhaust pipes unless it's to run speakers through them to make fake engine noise.
Perfect. All right, let's talk about some of the other things in the back of this. We have aluminum double wishbone rear suspension and another Yamaha lateral damper over here.
Yeah, so the front and the rear lateral dampers are becoming more common in the Japanese community. We see them in the Lexus products from their F-Sport SUVs have added it. I believe the CT 300 maybe even had one, that hatchback thing.
Oh, wow.
And the LC just got one. So part of the lateral damper job is to take the stiffness and create some type of isolation under lateral load and soften it up. It does have, you can tune them like draw stiffeners to create preload on the chassis, but most of these types of dampers are to reduce lateral vibration and shock, so you can tune the chassis stiffer while the driver may not feel it as much.
No, it makes sense in a car like this, which is supposed to be a dedicated sports car, but in reality it serves daily duty for most people. So the last thing to bring up, other than the fuel pumps, are the limited slip differentials in these cars. If you get a Sport or a Nismo, and I believe it's an option package on the Touring, you can get a VLSD, which is a viscous limited slip differential. And they are famously terrible in these 370Zs. They're a non-serviceable item. The viscous clutch packs, the fluid in them cannot be serviced.
Okay.
You can drain the fluid out of the diff, but what actually makes this thing work fails all the time. And once you start putting a lot of heat into it, it becomes an open diff. If you want to track this car, which is supposed to be the Nismo package, becomes an open diff once you start to overheat it. And then the rest of this car also has notorious cooling problems with the brakes and the engine.
So why not just swap this bad boy out for a 3.5-way LSD? I can do it on Gran Turismo.
Well, you can, and that's what a lot of people end up doing to these cars if they try turning them into a more track-oriented vehicle.
Well, let's talk about the engine.
All right.
Underneath the 370Z, Jack.
Yes, this is the famous VQ engine, Mark. This is a 3.7-liter V6. It revs to about 7,500 RPM. It makes 350 horsepower. And it does not stand for very quality. At least that's what the VQ doesn't stand for, because early cars, specifically the 2009 to say 2011 vehicles, had oil consumption issues. I'm sure it's also plagued some of the later ones, but I haven't heard as many problems. The other two things to bring up: cooling issues. 370Zs are notorious for running into issues with oil temperatures when you're tracking these cars. And then lastly, the other notorious failure point is the clutch slave cylinder failure, also known as a CSC failure, which, if you take it to a dealer, is probably going to cost you about $1,000, but you can do it yourself relatively easily.
That's about it.
Yeah, other than that, honestly, I mean, it's a simple V6. There aren't too many problems with it. Most performance cars have issues, like I mentioned, but they're stout. There's a huge aftermarket with these things, and it's what most enthusiasts are asking for. And the fact that you can pick these up, not the new ones and not the Nismos, but the standard cars for cheap, and they make a ton of power, it makes it a very appealing option for a lot of younger enthusiasts.
Well, we're going to find out more when we put this thing out on the street and put these winter tires to the test. Jack.
Oh yeah, Mark, oh yeah.
Oh, Jack. Ooh, the Nismo 370Z. Show me.
All right.
Oh, God, dude. That fake engine noise is the worst.
This is not a good sounding car.
It's not good sounding. Well, I know people like the V6 in here, and I've heard Nissans and Infinitis with decent sounding exhausts and all that, but this car, oh my God, I can't believe that they put the fake engine noise. They did that in 2015, and it's through the lovely Bose audio system with noise cancellation, and all it does is sound like a little 5-year-old on a Casio keyboard. It's so bad. Oh my God.
Yeah, this car sounds like it's straight out of Forza, or Gran
worse
Turismo.
than that.
Yeah,
no, it's like somebody that was making their My First simulation of an engine sound. It's so bad.
Yeah, this is an interesting car for me. As we talked about in the shop, the prices that you can get this in the used market, depending on which variant of Z, can be very cheap. You can get them in the teens. This, though, is a $45,000 car today in 2020. And time has not been in this car's favor. It doesn't have the timelessness of an S2000 or even a Miata. That's because, to me, it's not a focused product.
I don't know that I 100% agree with that. I feel like at the time it was developed, it was focused at being a Japanese muscle car. And with aftermarket support and the things that were out for it in its era when it was released, it's extremely competent.
In 2009, yes.
Well, yeah, if you want to talk about this as a new car, don't buy it as a new car. And I think we said the same thing about the Special Edition. And take out the head unit while you're at it so I don't have to hear that fake engine noise anymore. But for its era, it was appropriate. It was competitive.
But that's because the American cars in 2009 were not that good. The Mustang and the Camaro in 2009 were not good. But in 2015, when this thing was last updated, or 2014, you had the S550 Mustang, and then shortly afterwards, the 6th gen Camaro. And they are similar used prices to these Nismos. And they are in every conceivable fashion a better car.
But they're not Japanese, Jack.
I don't care. Who cares?
No, the S550. So, as a new car purchase, there is no conceivable way that you would choose this from a performance perspective over those other cars.
The
Pretty much
Camaro
anything.
SS 1LE, used and new, are in the same prices as this thing, and that thing annihilates this car.
You have to love this brand. You have to love Nissan to justify it. I just don't think it's worth it. I think this is absolutely 100% like a $20,000 used car.
And at that point, when you're comparing it to like an 86, sure, but the 86 feels better the harder you drive it. This is a 7/10 car. The steering doesn't feel that precise. The shifter, when you rush it, isn't very good. And yes, you have hydraulic steering, but you feel nothing through the front wheel. All of your inputs feel like there's like 50 pounds of rubber between you and actually feeling anything in this car. And the V6, yes, it revs out to 7,500 RPM, which is fine. That's a really admirable trait about this vehicle. And it's fast, but it doesn't sound good. And once you pass 6,800 RPM, it feels like it's totally out of wind.
So let's just forget about the fact that you hate this car for a minute, okay? And get to the point where you're not buying it new at 45 grand or 47 grand with an automatic. You're buying it at 25,000 as a used car. Let's talk about the merits of how good this is as a enthusiast car at that point.
Makes good horsepower. It's genuinely quick. There's a high overhead in this car once you go to the aftermarket. At that point, I get it, right? If you have no perception as well of what an S2000, a Miata, the newer Mustangs, Camaros, Corvettes, a lot of the newer sports cars feel like, and you're coming from an Altima or a Fusion or a Civic,
yeah,
this is God's car.
This is if you're going to go in that used price range of S2000, Miatas, older Japanese cars of that era. It's rear-wheel drive, it's still quick, and it is capable on track. I mean, yes, it's got braking stuff, it's got cooling stuff, like any car, but this is a really capable car if you're driving it and you know what to change on it. And I think that's why it's held up, and that's why it's got a rabid following. I mean, I've been in cars that are set up for autocross with the right dampers, the right brake setup, the right cooling, and they're really fun. They're really fun.
I mean, autocross, but you take that same car to the track and then it's unusable.
I don't know, man. Would you rather have this at 350 something, or I don't even know what it is, 300 plus horsepower over an 86 for the same price?
Having owned an 86, now spent 2 different loan periods in this car, I would take an 86 every single time, unless you're just chasing numbers.
I don't know. I think you're getting the V6, which is really reliable in this car, and you're getting speed, which you're not getting on a lot of the eco piles.
Sure.
Like the 86 is slow as hell.
I agree.
The Miata has way more torque, but it's still not fast. The S2000, I mean, you can have a nap by the time it hits the quarter mile. This still of that generation
if you
car
want a
is
fast car that has to be Japanese, you want to be able to modify it, you have a huge aftermarket support network, you can make these cars great. I agree with you, but I don't know, I think time has moved on, and the American counterparts now are so much better.
There are other cars, if we're looking at 2020, 2021, you're 100% right. If you want this car, you get a Mustang or you get a Camaro, even though the Camaro's update was horrible. They are far superior cars in almost every measurable way from that performance perspective. I do like the simplicity of this car. I do like that it still feels like a 90s, 2000s car and there's not a lot of bullshit with it, but it's not enough for me to be like, oh, I gotta spend $45,000. There's just no possible way.
The bones of this are good, and I'm excited for the 400Z. They'll update the engine, you've updated the interior, they've retuned the suspension, you know.
Yeah, it's something to look forward to, and it's something to look forward with this car as a used proposition. But let's get into the final thoughts, Jack.
All right.
Final thoughts on the 370Z Nismo. Everything that needed to be said was said during the drive, but I need to put this out there. When you look at this car as a whole, time has moved on. There's no doubt about it. It doesn't feel like modern sports cars. It feels like yesteryear or 2-generation-old sports cars, and that's exactly why you buy it. You certainly don't buy this new unless you got some screws loose, and I'm sorry to Nissan. I know they continue to make it. That's also one of the great reasons to buy it used, is because they are still producing the parts for this. They're not discontinued like 10-year-old Fords. And there's so many good things from drivability perspective. You have old school steering. You have a manual transmission that there's vibration through, that the manual transmission's not isolated out. You still feel vibration. The chassis is amazing even for its age. It just, for me, there's certain cars that I feel like communicate with you better right out of the box. Like S2000s, the ND or NC Miatas can be a lot more fun, but this thing's still fast. Jack makes the argument, why even bother with this when you can get the American muscle cars or the American performance cars that'll just blow the doors off this? And I get the argument, but this has something about it that I know is super appealing, from style to look to design. It's classic Nissan. And if you're getting it for $25,000, have at it. Enjoy it, modify it, experience a rear-wheel drive Japanese muscle car. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it. I did say this in the previous Nissan video we did on the 370. This car will have a cool factor in about 10, 15 years. Once they stop making this, once it's gone, people will be like, oh man, that's a cool car. It's a classic Nissan. And I really do think it's going to be one of those cars that just, we're blinded right now, like, oh, why are they still making this? And then when it's gone, people are like, oh, I wish they still made this. And that's life as somebody that loves enthusiast products. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.